Welcome to Horrified Stories, where fear comes to life. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. The 7th midnight, the bus screeched to a halt on the gravel road, its headlights illuminating the dense mist curling around the towering pines. Mara Aldridge hesitated before stepping out, clutching her worn duffel bag tightly. The driver, an older man with sallow skin and hollow eyes, didn't say a word. He only nodded toward the narrow dirt path ahead, before pulling the door shut and disappearing down the winding road. The sound of the engine faded into silence, leaving Mara alone beneath a suffocating blanket of fog. She checked her phone. No signal. The eerie quiet of the forest felt unnatural, as though even the crickets had decided it was best to stay silent tonight. Mara exhaled sharply, reminding herself why she was here. Blackthorn Manor, her estranged great-aunt Sybil's sprawling estate. The letter had arrived 3 weeks ago, brittle parchment sealed with crimson wax. Sybil claimed to be dying, urging Mara to come immediately. "You're the only one I can trust." The letter had read, strange words from a woman Mara had never met. The path wound deeper into the woods, the trees pressing in on either side like dark sentinels. By the time Mara caught her first glimpse of the manor, her unease had grown into a knowing dread. Blackthorn Manor loomed before her, its spires piercing the night sky like blackened teeth. The building was a relic of another time, its stone walls slick with moss and decay. Windows glinted faintly, reflecting the pale moonlight, though no lights burned within. As Mara approached the heavy oak door, it creaked open on its own, revealing a yawning darkness inside. She hesitated, glancing back toward the woods. The fog had thickened, erasing the path she'd taken. There was no going back. Clutching her bag, she stepped inside. The air inside was stale, carrying a faint metallic tang that made Mara's stomach churn. The faint flicker of candlelight illuminated a cavernous foyer, its walls lined with faded tapestries and portraits of grim-faced ancestors. A grand staircase spiraled upward into shadows. "Miss Aldridge, I presume." Mara jumped, spinning toward the voice. A tall woman stood at the edge of the candlelight, her sharp features framed by silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe bun. Her black dress was immaculate, though the fabric seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. "I'm Mrs. Harper," the woman said, her voice clipped. "I've been expecting you." Mara nodded, unsure how to respond. Mrs. Harper's eyes were an unsettling shade of gray, almost colorless, and they never seemed to blink. "Your room has been prepared. Follow me." Without waiting for a reply, Mrs. Harper turned and ascended the staircase, her footsteps eerily silent on the worn wooden steps. Mara hurried to keep up, her shoes squeaking faintly in the oppressive silence. The upper corridors were even darker than the foyer, the walls lined with more portraits, their eyes following her as she passed. At the end of the hall, Mrs. Harper pushed open a heavy door. The room was sparsely furnished, a canopy bed draped in dark velvet, a small writing desk, and a wardrobe that loomed like a shadow in the corner. A single candle burned on the bedside table, its flame flickering wildly despite the absence of a breeze. "Dinner will be served at midnight," Mrs. Harper said, her voice low. "Do not wander the halls before then. It is unwise." Before Mara could ask what she meant, the housekeeper was gone, the door clicking shut behind her. Mara stood in the dim light, her unease growing with each passing second. Something about this place was wrong, deeply, profoundly wrong. Mara spent the next few hours unpacking her bag and trying to settle her nerves. She found a worn journal in the desk drawer, its pages filled with incomprehensible symbols and scrawled notes in an unfamiliar hand. One phrase was repeated over and over: "The 7th midnight approaches." When the grandfather clock in the foyer struck 12, its chimes reverberated through the manor like a death knell. Mara made her way to the dining room, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The table was an imposing slab of mahogany, set with silver candlesticks and a feast that seemed untouched. Mrs. Harper stood at the head of the table, her face expressionless. "You're late," she said. Mara began, but the words died in her throat. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving with an unnatural grace. It was Sybil. The old woman was frail, her skin paper-thin and mottled with bruises, but her eyes burned with a fierce intensity. She gripped a cane in one hand, though she didn't seem to use it for support. "Sit," Sybil commanded, her voice rasping like dry leaves. Mara obeyed, her pulse quickening. Sybil leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "You are here because you have a role to play. This house, it is not just stone and timber. It is alive. It remembers." "Remembers what?" Mara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sybil's lips curled into a grim smile. "The promises we made, the debts we owe." Before Mara could press further, the lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. When the candles flared back to life, Sybil was gone. Only Mrs. Harper remained, her expression unreadable. "You should go to bed," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "The house does not take kindly to those who linger." Mara couldn't sleep. The events of the evening played over and over in her mind, each detail more unsettling than the last. Around 3 a.m., a faint sound reached her ears, a low, mournful cry echoing through the halls. Against her better judgment, she slipped out of bed and into the corridor. The cry grew louder as she moved toward the west wing, a part of the house Mrs. Harper had explicitly warned her to avoid. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to writhe as though alive. At the end of the hall, she found a door slightly ajar. Pushing it open, she stepped into a room filled with mirrors. Each one reflected her image back at her, though the faces in the glass didn't quite match her own. They were smiling far too wide. Mara stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. When she turned to leave, the door slammed shut. The mirrors began to crack, spiderweb fractures spreading across the glass as the cries rose to a deafening crescendo. And then she saw a figure in the largest mirror, its eyes like black voids, its hands pressed against the inside of the glass as though trying to break free. "7 nights," it whispered, its voice like a blade scraping against stone. "You must not fail." Mara screamed, the sound tearing from her throat as the mirror shattered, plunging the room into darkness. Mara awoke drenched in sweat, her heartbeat hammering in her chest. She was back in her room, though she had no memory of returning after the events in the mirror room. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and faint whispers echoed from somewhere beyond the walls. She shot up, clutching the edge of the bed, only to notice something chilling, a shard of mirror glass on the nightstand. Its jagged edges gleamed in the pale morning light. It wasn't a dream. Her body trembled as she dressed hurriedly. She needed answers, but from whom? Sybil, the cryptic and vanishing host, or Mrs. Harper, whose cold demeanor made Mara question her loyalties. She decided to explore again. This time in daylight, the shrouded light outside the manor could even be called that. The halls of Blackthorn Manor seemed more oppressive during the day. The shadows lingered unnaturally long, pulling in corners where no light dared touch. The faint sound of muffled weeping echoed through the west wing, pulling her attention once again to the forbidden area. She wanted to resist, but something compelled her forward. The west wing was colder, as if the warmth of life had abandoned it. The doors were tightly shut, their frames warped with age, and the wallpaper peeled back to reveal dark, water-stained wood. At the end of the hall, Mara found a door unlike the others. It was reinforced with iron and marked with deep, claw-like scratches. Before she could second to guess herself, she turned the knob. The door creaked open to reveal a spiral staircase descending into darkness. She hesitated, her breath clouding in the frigid air, but the faint sound of whispers urged her downward. The steps groaned beneath her weight as she descended into what felt like an endless abyss. The air grew damper, the walls slick with moisture, and the faint smell of mildew was overpowered by something far worse, rot. At the bottom of the staircase, Mara found herself in a cavernous basement. Old crates and furniture were stacked haphazardly, draped in cobwebs. At the center of the room was a trapdoor, its edges marked with strange, archaic symbols carved into the wood. A faint thumping sound emanated from beneath it, like the beating of a distant drum. Mara crouched, running her fingers over the carvings. They were warm to the touch, pulsing faintly beneath her skin. "Meddling will cost you dearly." The voice came from behind her, low and venomous. Mara turned sharply to see Mrs. Harper standing in the shadows, her expression colder than ever. "What is this place?" Mara demanded. "What's under there?" Mrs. Harper's gray eyes narrowed. "Something that should never be disturbed. Leave this room at once." "Tell me what's going on." Mara's voice rose, fueled by fear and frustration. "Why did my aunt call me here? What is this house?" Mrs. Harper stepped closer, her presence towering and foreboding. "This house is a tomb, Miss Aldrich, a prison for things that should never see the light of day. If you value your life, you will stop asking questions." Before Mara could argue, Mrs. Harper grabbed her arm with a strength that belied her age and hauled her back up the stairs. She didn't release her until they were back in the main hall. "You are not to enter the west wing again," Mrs. Harper said, her tone brooking no argument. "Do not test the house's patience." The knock came again, louder this time. Gathering her courage, Mara crossed the room and flung the door open. The hallway was empty, the flickering candlelight casting eerie shadows on the walls. But on the floor, just outside her door, was another shard of mirror glass, This one was larger, its surface smeared with something dark and wet. She slammed the door shut and locked it, her hands trembling. Sleep was impossible that night. She spent the hours until dawn huddled on the bed, clutching the journal like a lifeline. The next morning, Mara demanded to see Sybil. She found her aunt in a dimly lit parlor, seated in a high-backed chair near a dying fire. Sybil's frailty was even more pronounced in the daylight, her skin almost translucent, her eyes sunken. "You saw it, didn't you?" Sybil rasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "The trapdoor." Mara nodded, her throat dry. "What's under there? What does it have to do with me?" Sybil's thin lips twisted into a bitter smile. "You are an Aldridge. That alone makes you part of this curse." "What curse?" Sybil's gaze hardened. 7 midnights. That is how long the seals will hold. On the 7th, if the ritual is not completed, the house will fall, and what lies beneath will rise. Mara's stomach churned. "What ritual? What are you talking about?" But Sybil only shook her head. "You will understand soon enough. Just remember this. The house does not care for you. It obeys only one master, what lies beneath." Before Mara could press further, Sybil's body convulsed, and she collapsed into a fit of violent coughing. Mrs. Harper appeared almost instantly, ushering Mara out of the room with a steely glare. That night, the whispers returned, louder than ever. The mirrors in her room began to fog over, images flickering across their surfaces, images of people Mara didn't recognize. They stared at her, their expressions a mix of sorrow and terror. As the clock struck midnight, the floor beneath her bed began to vibrate faintly, as though something deep below the house was stirring. The whispers coalesced into a single word, repeated over and over. 7. Mara clutched her ears, desperate to drown out the sound, but it was inside her head, burrowing deep into her mind. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mara knew then that she couldn't leave Blackthorn Manor, not until she understood the truth, not until she stopped whatever was coming. Because something was coming. Mara woke to the sound of something scraping against her window. The room was still shrouded in darkness, the clock on the nightstand reading 3:33 a.m. She sat her day up, her heart pounding. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate, like nails striking across the glass. Summoning what little courage she had, Mara crept toward the window. Her breath fogged the pain as she peered into the night. At first, she saw nothing but swirling mist. Then a shadow shifted, a tall, gaunt figure standing at the edge of the forest. Its face was indistinct, shrouded in darkness, but its eyes burned like twin embers, locked directly onto her. Mara stumbled back, the window rattling as if struck by a sudden gust of wind. When she looked again, the figure was gone. The house groaned around her, the sound reverberating through the walls like a living thing stretching its limbs. She turned toward the door, intent on finding Mrs. Harper or Sybil, but when she opened it, the hallway was wrong. The familiar corridor leading to the main staircase was gone, replaced by a narrow passage lined with rotting wood. The air was damp, carrying the stench of mildew and decay. Mara hesitated, but the faint sound of whispers urged her forward. As she walked, the walls seemed to close in around her, the floorboards creaking on her foot. The whispers grew louder, morphing into a cacophony of voices, speaking in a language she didn't understand. She pressed her hands over her ears, her pulse racing. Just as the pressure became unbearable, the passage ended abruptly in front of a door she didn't recognize. Carved into the wood was the same symbol she'd seen on the trapdoor in the basement. Before she could decide whether to turn back or enter, the door creaked open on its own. The room beyond was bathed in a sickly green light, its walls covered in faded, peeling wallpaper. A heavy, metallic smell hung in the air, making Mara's stomach churn. In the center of the room stood a single object, a full-length mirror in an ornate gold frame. As Mara stepped closer, she realized the mirror wasn't reflecting the room behind her. Instead, it showed something else entirely: vast, desolate landscape under a blood-red sky. Shadows writhed across the ground, their forms indistinct but unmistakably alive. And then she saw them, faces, pressed against the surface of the mirror from the inside. They weren't a reflection, they were people down scenes of them, their mouths moving silently as if screaming. Their eyes were wide with terror, their hands clawing at the glass. Mara stumbled back, her breath hitching. One of the faces moved closer, its features becoming clear. It was Sybil. Her gray-tanned face was twisted with anguish, her lips forming words that Mara couldn't hear. But the message was clear: run. Before Mara could react, the mirror began to crack, fractures spreading outward like veins of lightning. The faces disappeared, replaced by a single black void that seemed to pulse with hunger. A low growl emanated from the mirror, and Mara realized with dawning horror that something was trying to break through. She turned and bolted, the door slamming shut behind her as she fled down the shifting corridor. By the time she found herself back in her room, Mara was shaking. She locked the door, her mind racing. The mirror, the faces, the thing in the glass, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle she didn't understand. She grabbed the journal, flipping through its pages frantically. Near the end, she found a passage that sent a chill down her spine. The Watcher feeds on fear, drawing strength from the souls it traps. Each midnight brings it closer to freedom. Beware the mirrors that are its eyes. Mara glanced at the small mirror hanging above her dresser. It seemed harmless in the dim light, but now she couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her. She grabbed a scarf and threw it over the mirror, her pulse pounding. As she did, a sharp pain shot through her left hand. She looked down to see a fresh cut on her palm, blood welling from the wound. The cut was jagged, but it wasn't random. It was the same symbol from the trapdoor, etched into her flesh. Panic surged through her. She wrapped her hand in a piece of cloth and paced the room, trying to make sense of everything. The journal's warnings, the mirrors, the strange events, he all pointed to one horrifying conclusion. The Watcher was breaking free, and Mara was somehow tied to it. The next morning, Mara confronted Sybil. The old woman was in her parlor again, looking even frailer than before. Her breathing was labored, her hands trembling as she sipped from a porcelain teacup. "You knew this would happen," Mara said, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "You brought me here for a reason. Tell me the truth." Sybil set the teacup down with a trembling hand, her eyes meeting Mara's. There was no defiance in her gaze, only resignation. "You're right," she said. "I brought you here because you're the last of us, the last Aldrich." "What does that mean?" Mara demanded. Sybil sighed, her shoulders sagging. "The Aldrich family made a pact centuries ago, a pact to bind the Watcher and keep it imprisoned beneath this house. But the pact comes with a cost. Every generation, one of us must serve as its guardian, renewing the seals and keeping it contained." Mara's blood ran cold. "And you want me to do it?" "I can't," Sybil said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've grown too weak. The house no longer listens to me. If the seals aren't renewed by the 7th midnight, the Watcher will be free, and it will consume everything." Mara shook her head, backing away. "No, this is insane. I didn't ask for this." "None of us did," Sybil said, her tone sharp. "But it doesn't matter. You have a choice to make, Mara. Either you renew the seals, or the world dies." That night, Mara couldn't sleep. The weight of Sybil's words pressed down on her like a suffocating blanket. She spent hours reading the journal, trying to piece together how to renew the seals. The instructions were cryptic, filled with symbols and rituals she didn't understand. As the clock struck midnight, the house came alive again. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and the floor began to tremble. Mara lit a candle, her eyes darting around the room. And then she heard a low, guttural growl emanating from beneath the floorboards. It wasn't just in her room, it was everywhere, resonating through the entire house. The Watcher was hungry, desperate. Mara grabbed the journal and a flashlight, deciding to return to the basement. If the trapdoor held the key to stopping this, she had to see it again. The journey through the house was a nightmare. The walls seemed to ripple like water, and shadows moved on their own. The whispers followed her, growing louder with each step. When she reached the basement, she found the trapdoor wide open. The symbols that had once glowed faintly were now dark, though it splintered as though something had clawed its way out. A deep, resonant voice echoed from the darkness below. "You are too late." Mara frowned, her flashlight shaking in her hand. From the pit beneath the trapdoor, something began to rise, a massive, shadowy form, its shape ever shifting, its eyes burning like fire. Mara stood frowning, her flashlight illuminating the impossible. The Watcher's shadowy form loomed from the pit, an amalgamation of darkness and fire. It had no definitive shape. Its limbs morphed and writhed like smoke caught in a storm. Its eyes, burning like molten coals, bored into her, and she felt a presence far older and more malevolent than anything she had ever imagined. "You cannot stop me," the Watcher said, its voice reverberating like thunder. "The seals are broken. Your blood calls to me." Mara clutched the journal in her trembling hands, flipping through its pages in a desperate attempt to find anything that could help her. The ritual was detailed, but the language was arcane, the instructions fragmented. Her flashlight flickered, plunging the room into darkness. When it came back on, the Watcher was closer, its form spilling out of the pit like an encroaching shadow. "No!" Mara screamed, stumbling backward. "Stay back." But the watcher only laughed, a guttural sound that shook the walls. "You were brought here for this, Mara Aldridge. You are the final key." A sudden light filled the basement, blinding in its intensity. Mara shielded her eyes as a figure descended the stairs. It was Sybil, clutching a staff adorned with glowing runes. Her frail body seemed almost translucent, her eyes filled with both fear and determination. "Get away from her," Sybil commanded, slamming the staff into the ground. The runes flared, sending a wave of energy toward the watcher. The creature recoiled, its form distorting as it hissed in fury. "Foolish woman," the watcher growled, "you cannot hold me forever." Sybil turned to Mara, her face pale but resolute. "The ritual, it must be completed. You're the only one who can do it now." "I don't know how," Mara cried. "I don't understand any of this." Sybil placed a trembling hand on Mara's shoulder. "You don't need to understand. You just need to trust your blood. It's in you, Mara. The power to seal this thing is in you." Before Mara could respond, the watcher surged forward, its shadowy tendrils lashing out. Sybil raised the staff, creating a barrier of light that held the creature back. But it was clear she was struggling. "Go," Sybil shouted. "The altar under the trapdoor. Everything you need is there." Mara hesitated, torn between fleeing and helping her great aunt. But the look in Sybil's eyes left no room for argument. With a final glance back, Mara ran toward the open trapdoor, descending into the darkness below. The air beneath the trapdoor was suffocating, heavy with the stench of decay and burnt wood. Mara's flashlight revealed a cavernous chamber, its walls covered in ancient carvings that seemed to shift and writhe under her gaze. At the center of the chamber was an altar made of black stone, surrounded by 7 iron chains anchored to the ground. The journal's final pages described this place in haunting detail. The altar was the heart of the seals, the point where the watcher had been bound centuries ago. To renew the seals, Mara would need to perform the ritual and make a sacrifice. Her blood. Mara's hands trembled as she placed the journal on the altar. The instructions were clear: carve the sigil of binding into the stone, recite the incantation, and offer her blood to seal the watcher away. But she didn't have the tools or the knowledge to carve the sigil. The ground trembled, and a guttural roar echoed from above. The watcher was growing stronger, and Sybil's barrier wouldn't hold for long. Mara's mind raced as she searched the chamber for anything that could help. Her eyes fell on a jagged shard of metal lying near the altar. It looked like it had been broken off one of the chains. Grabbing the shard, she began to carve the sigil into the stone. Her hands slick with sweat, the ancient symbols glowed faintly as she worked. As though responding to her touch, she felt a strange warmth in her chest, as if the very blood in her veins was guiding her movements. As Mara finished the sigil, the carvings on the walls flared to life, their light casting eerie shadows across the chamber. She opened the journal to the final page, where the incantation was written in a language she didn't recognize. The words seemed to pulse on the page, shifting and rearranging themselves until she could read them. She began to recite, her voice shaking but steady. The chamber seemed to hum with energy, the air vibrating as if the house itself was coming alive. The chains around the altar rattled, their iron links glowing red-hot. Above, she could hear Sybil scream, a sound of both defiance and pain. Mara faltered, her voice breaking, but she forced herself to continue. That incantation demanded her focus, her belief. As she spoke the final words, the sigil on the altar flared with blinding light. The chains snapped taut, their glowing links shooting upward and piercing the cavern ceiling. A deafening roar filled the chamber as the watcher's presence surged, its shadow spilling into the room. "You cannot contain me," the watcher bellowed, its form writhing against the chains. "Your blood is mine, Aldridge." Mara grabbed the shard of metal and slashed it across her palm, her blood dripping onto the sigil. The altar absorbed it greedily, the light intensifying as the chains tightened around the watcher. The creature screamed, its form distorting, collapsing in on itself as the seals began to reforge. But the ritual demanded more. A sudden pain ripped through Mara's chest, and she realized the house wasn't just taking her blood, it was taking her life force. Her vision blurred, her strength waning, but she held on, pouring everything she had into the ritual. The watcher's form shrank, pulled inexorably into the sigil. Its screams became a whisper, then silence. As the chains anchored it once again, the light in the chamber faded, leaving Mara slumped against the altar, her body weak and trembling. She wasn't sure how long she lay there, the silence pressing down on her like a weight. When she finally managed to stand, she climbed back up to the basement, her legs shaky. The house was eerily quiet, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Sybil was lying at the bottom of the stairs, her body motionless. Mara rushed to her side, cradling her frail form. Sybil's eyes fluttered open, and a faint smile crossed her lips. You did it, Sybil whispered. You stopped it. Mara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. You shouldn't have sacrificed yourself for me. It wasn't for you, Sybil said, her voice barely audible. It was for all of us. With that, Sybil's eyes closed, and she exhaled one final breath. Days passed before Mara could bring herself to leave Blackthorn Manor. She buried Sybil in the overgrown cemetery behind the house, marking the grave with a simple stone. The house seemed different, now quieter, less oppressive, but the weight of what had happened lingered. The journal Saturday on the parlor table, its pages filled with the history of the Aldrich family and their eternal duty to keep the Watcher contained. Mara knew she couldn't stay. The house may have been safe for now, but the seals wouldn't hold forever. Someday, the Watcher would stir again, and another Aldrich would have to answer the call. As she walked away from the manor, the sun breaking through the clouds for the first time in days, she made a silent vow. She would learn everything she could about the seals, about the Watcher, about her family's cursed legacy, because she knew the 7th midnight would come again. And next time, she would be ready. Guys, if you wish that we make the sequel of this story, drop your comment, hit the like button and subscribe the channel.